want to start this one a little differently. A few days ago, on a complete whim, I sat down and rewatched Space Battleship Yamato, the live-action film. I hadn't seen it in years, not since the last time I went down a classic sci-fi rabbit hole, and I didn't expect it to hit the way it did, but it did. I grew up with Star Blazers in the 80s when I was a kid, and that was a cartoon version of it, and it was called Star Blazers. That's the American name for Space Battleship Yamato. There's something about Yamato that still works. The scale, the desperation, the idea of humanity pushed to the brink, flinging a warship into space not because it's flashy, but because it's the last option left. The space battles aren't just spectacle, they matter. In every hit, every maneuver, every sacrifice feels earned. And once it ended, instead of just moving on, I realized something. It made me curious. Not just about anime, not just about nostalgia. It made me wonder what other international science fiction stories are out there that approach action the same way. Stories outside the usual Hollywood orbit. Stories that care about scale, consequence, and motion. Stories where action isn't just noise, but language. And that curiosity turned into a question. If Space Battleship Yamato represents one vision of sci-fi action, what else exists beyond it? What are other countries doing with science fiction when the focus is movement, conflict, and survival? And more specifically, what does international science fiction look like when it leans fully into action? From there, the question narrowed even further. Not quiet, philosophical sci-fi, not purely speculative concepts, but science fiction that puts energy on the screen. Space battles, mechanized combat, chases, invasions, last stands. The kind of stories where things move, collide, and break, whether that happens in orbit, underground, or in the middle of a collapsing city. And that's what sent me down this path, looking for international science fiction films, live action, not just animated, that lean into action in meaningful ways. Films that experiment with scale, technology, and conflict without filtering everything through a Hollywood blockbuster lens. Some of them are serious, some are messy, some are wild experiments that shouldn't work but somehow do, and all of them are interesting. So in this video, I want to look at a few of those films, not as ranking, not as hidden gems you must like, but as examples of how science fiction action looks when it's shaped by different cultures, budgets, histories, and creative instincts. And in several cases, how that action takes the form of space warfare, mechanized combat, or large-scale destructive spectacle. Because sometimes all it takes is revisiting one old space battleship to remember why you fell in love with science fiction action in the first place. And sometimes that's enough to send you searching for what else is out there. So, let's see what else is out there. So we might as well start with the Space Battleship Yamato. The 2010 Space Battleship Yamato is a live-action adaptation of the legendary anime series that first aired in 1974, and calling it just an adaptation really undersells how loaded the story already is. The premise is famously simple and heavy at the same time. Earth has been devastated by alien bombardment. Humanity is on the brink of extinction. Radiation has made the planet almost uninhabitable. The last hope isn't a fleet or a miracle weapon, it's a single ship. Humanity resurrects the sunken World War II battleship Yamato, rebuilds it as a starship, and sends it on a one-year journey across the galaxy to retrieve something that can save the Earth. From the beginning, this story is about final chances. If you're here specifically for space battles, this film fully delivers, but in a way that feels very different from modern sci-fi. The Yamato fights like a battleship. Combat is deliberate, heavy, and methodical. Weapons charge slowly, damage feels cumulative, every engagement has a cost. This isn't dogfighting spectacle, this is space combat treated like naval warfare, and what really matters is scale, not in explosions, but in consequence. Every battle brings the ship closer to failure, every victory feels temporary, there's no sense that help is coming. This is where Space Battleship Yamato stands apart from almost everything else. The film is completely earnest. No irony, no self-awareness, no jokes undercutting the moment. From the moment the ship launches, the question isn't will they win, it's what will winning cost and who won't make it back. Sacrifice isn't a twist in this movie, it's a baseline assumption, and the crew knows it. One of the most important things about this film is what the Yamato represents. In Japanese history, the real Yamato is a deeply symbolic object tied to national trauma, loss, and the consequences of militarism. The live-action film doesn't glorify that history. Instead, it reframes the Yamato. This time, the battleship isn't used to dominate others, it's used to save what's left of humanity. That idea, turning an object of destruction into an instrument of survival, is a huge reason why Yamato still resonates. The ship isn't just a setting, it's the last remnant of Earth itself, flying through hostile space. The 2010 film isn't without issues. Some of the visual effects show their age, certain characters are underdeveloped, and compressing a long serialized story into a single movie flattens some emotional arcs. If you come in expecting Hollywood-level polish, you'll notice the rough edges, but what it lacks in refinement, it compensates for in commitment. This movie believes in its story completely. Space Battleship Yamato is different. It's about duty you can't escape, a mission you might not survive, and a quiet understanding that saving humanity doesn't mean saving yourself. That's why it feels older and heavier. Even if you never saw the original anime, this live-action film matters for one simple reason. It treats space warfare as existential, not exciting. No one fights because they want to, they fight because extinction leaves no alternatives. That perspective influenced decades of science fiction in Japan and beyond, and you can still see its DNA in modern serious sci-fi today. The 2010 Space Battleship Yamato isn't just a remake, it's a statement about sacrifice, about memory, about what survival actually demands. It may not be flashy by modern standards, but if you're interested in space battles where every shot feels like it matters, Yamato is still essential.
A symbol of our values and knowledge. It will carry a message of peace and unity to the farthest reaches of the universe. Our thoughts and prayers go with you.
Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets from 2017 is a large-scale European science fiction space opera written and directed by Luc Besson and produced primarily in France. It is notable for being one of the most expensive non-Hollywood sci-fi films ever made and for embracing a very different tone and lineage than American space operas. In the 28th century, Alpha, also known as the City of a Thousand Planets, is a colossal space station formed by centuries of peaceful cooperation between Earth and countless alien civilizations. Human agents Valerian and Laureline, special operatives working for a galactic governing body, are dispatched to investigate a threat growing at Alpha's core. What initially looks like a routine mission escalates into a civilization-level moral and political crisis. When a mysterious threat emerges from within Alpha itself, their mission expands into a conflict involving military force, political secrecy, and the consequences of expansionist power. The film consistently frames military force as something to be questioned, resisted, or undone. Even when battles occur, they are portrayed as consequences of political deception or moral blindness, not heroic inevitabilities. This is a very European sci-fi perspective. There's less emphasis on duty, honor, and heroic endurance, and more emphasis on empathy, coexistence, restitution, and moral responsibility. Valerian has been widely praised for visual imagination, production design, ambition, and non-American sci-fi sensibility, and just as widely criticized for uneven pacing, tonal inconsistency, and especially the chemistry between its two leads. For some viewers, those shortcomings overshadow everything else. For others, Valerian is a flawed but essential experiment, proof that large-scale space opera doesn't have to come from Hollywood or follow Hollywood's rules. Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets is not a perfect movie, but it is one of the most ambitious European sci-fi films ever made, a genuine live-action space opera with real space battles, and a clear example of how non-US science fiction tells different stories with the same tools. If you're interested in space warfare as cultural expression, not just a spectacle, Valerian is worth examining, even when it stumbles. This movie's from China. When most sci-fi movies show space battles, they're usually about factions fighting each other, empires, rebellions, good guys versus bad guys. The Wandering Earth 2 does something very different. In this movie, humanity isn't fighting another civilization. Humanity is fighting physics, time, and the death of the sun itself. Released in 2023, The Wandering Earth 2 is one of the most ambitious live-action science fiction films ever made outside the United States, and it might be the most serious space battle movie of the last decade. So let's talk about what this film is actually doing, why it feels so different from Hollywood sci-fi, and why it belongs in the same conversation as Starship Yamato when we talk about sacrifice and survival in space. Despite the title, The Wandering Earth 2 is actually a prequel. It takes place earlier during humanity's first attempt to save itself after discovering an unavoidable truth. The sun is dying, and when it goes, Earth goes with it. Instead of abandoning the planet, humanity makes a radical choice. They will move the Earth itself out of the solar system. This requires planet-scale engineering, massive space infrastructure, and global military-industrial coordination on an unprecedented level. From the very beginning, this is not a story about individual heroes. It's a story about civilization acting as a single organism under pressure from extinction. The Wandering Earth 2 absolutely has large-scale space battles, but the enemy is rarely another species. Space combat here looks like orbital warfare around Earth and the Moon, armed space stations and defense platforms, coordinated fleet actions, and high-casualty engagements in zero-gravity environments. And when combat does happen, it's often defensive, desperate, and costly. There's very little triumph. Most victories feel temporary, like buying time rather than winning. This gives the space battles a very different emotional weight compared to Hollywood spectacle. If Valerian believes space war is a tragic mistake and Starship Yamato believes space war is an inevitable tragedy, The Wandering Earth 2 believes something even colder. Survival is a collective duty, regardless of cost. This movie is blunt about that. People are expected to give their lives. Entire programs are built around the assumption that most participants will not survive. Success is measured in generations, not individuals, and the film never apologizes for that worldview. There's no illusion that everyone matters equally when extinction is on the table. It's harsh, it's uncompromising, and it's very intentional. One of the most striking things about The Wandering Earth 2 is how normal massive militarization feels in this world. Space fleets aren't inspirational, they're infrastructure. AI systems aren't villains, they're tools until they're not. Combat isn't glorious, it's a logical necessity. This is science fiction that sees technology as something heavy, something that reshapes society whether people are ready or not. It's closer to disaster planning than adventure. If you line this film up against others in this niche, Starship Yamato asks individuals to sacrifice themselves for humanity. Valerian questions whether space war should exist at all. Space Sweepers shows survival through improvisation. The Wandering Earth 2 is different. It asks what happens when everyone is required to give something up. This is not a romantic vision of the future, it's a utilitarian one, and that makes it unsettling in a way most blockbuster sci-fi isn't willing to be. Hollywood sci-fi usually centers personal freedom, chosen heroism, and individual morality. The Wandering Earth 2 centers obligation, consensus, and survival through coordination. The idea that humanity might need to act like a single machine to survive is never framed as dystopian, it's framed as necessary. That alone makes this film feel alien to Western audiences, and that's exactly why it's interesting. This movie is not subtle. Characters often speak in declarations. Themes are stated clearly, sometimes bluntly. The runtime is long, and the scale can feel overwhelming. But subtlety isn't the goal here. Clarity is. The film wants you to understand exactly what's at stake, and exactly what it thinks survival requires. The Wandering Earth 2 is important not just because it's big or because it has impressive space battles. It's important because it shows a non-Western answer to one of science fiction's oldest questions: what does humanity owe itself when extinction is unavoidable? This film's answer is disturbing to some, inspiring to others, but it is never casual. The Wandering Earth 2 isn't just a sequel, it's a statement about collective survival, about sacrifice without sentimentality, about space battles as grim necessity, and about a future where heroism is measured not by victory but by endurance. endurance. If you're interested in space-set live-action sci-fi where battles actually mean something, this film belongs near the top of the list.
저건 내 거다. 밟아.
Most space battle movies are about fleets, governments, or civilizations fighting over the future. Space Sweepers isn't. This movie is about the people cleaning up the wreckage after that future has already gone wrong. Released in 2021, Space Sweepers is a South Korean live-action sci-fi film set almost entirely in space, and it features plenty of real space combat, but from a perspective you don't usually get. No admirals, no heroes, not chosen ones. Just people trying to survive in orbit while Earth quietly dies below them. So let's talk about what Space Sweepers is actually doing, how its space battles work, and why it fits surprisingly well alongside films like Starship Yamato and The Wandering Earth 2, even though it feels completely different on the surface. Space Sweepers is set in the year 2092. Earth is still technically alive, but environmentally wrecked. The wealthy have moved into orbit. The poor are stuck below or scraping by in space, doing the dirty jobs no one else wants. Our main characters are the crew of the Victory, a junk collection ship that survives by scavenging space debris and selling it for parts. They're not soldiers, they're not explorers, they're not building the future, they're cleaning up after it. That perspective matters because it shapes everything, including how the space battles feel. Yes, Space Sweepers absolutely has space battles. You see armed spacecraft, orbital chases, ship-to-ship firefights, and military forces enforcing control in Earth orbit. But these fights are never framed as grand strategy. From the crew's point of view, combat is chaotic, terrifying, and usually something to escape, not win. The Victory is not a warship, it's barely holding together. When battles happen, they feel messy and personal, closer to street fights than fleet engagements, and that's intentional. At first glance, Space Sweepers looks lighter than something like Yamato or The Wandering 2. There's humor, there's banter, the crew feels more like found family than military unit, but underneath that is something much darker. This is a future where inequality has gone orbital, survival is transactional, and idealism is a luxury no one on board can afford. The jokes aren't there to undercut the stakes, they're there because this is how people cope when the system has already failed them. One of the most important ideas in Space Sweepers is where power actually lives. It's not on Earth, it's not with nations, it's in orbit, controlled by corporations and elites who've already decided who gets a future and who doesn't. Space battles in this movie aren't about conquest, they're about control. Control of oxygen, control of orbit, control of who's allowed to survive above the atmosphere, and Victory's crew is constantly caught in the crossfire. If we line Space Sweepers up next to the others, you've been covering Starship Yamato shows noble sacrifice through duty. The Wandering Earth 2 shows collective survival at any cost. Valerian questions whether space war should exist at all. Space Sweepers asks a different question. What happens to the people who weren't invited into the future? There's no grand speech about saving humanity here. There's rent to pay, fuel to buy, and debts that never quite go away. That's what makes its space battles feel grounded, even when the visuals are large and chaotic. Space Sweepers succeeds because it takes space combat seriously without romanticizing it. Nobody wants to fight. Nobody comes out ahead. Every engagement risks losing the only thing keeping the crew alive, their ship. It's stylish, it's kinetic, but it's also grounded in consequences, and that combination is rare. If you're looking for solemn, slow, militarized sci-fi like Yamato, Space Sweepers might feel too loose. If you're expecting the philosophical weight of The Wandering Earth 2, this is smaller scale and more personal. This movie prioritizes character over ideology, and that's a deliberate choice. Space Sweepers earns its place alongside more serious space battle films because it it shows another side of the same future. Not the planners, not the admiral, not the visionaries, the workers, the people who survive between battles. And once you see space warfare from that perspective, it's hard to unsee. Space Sweepers is fully space set, live action, non-US, and filled with real space combat. But more importantly, it reminds us that any future involving space battles also involves cleanup, inequality, and people trying to survive on the margins. That makes it lighter than Yamato, but no less honest.
Live in Los Angeles. In the last 5 minutes...
When people talk about Chinese science fiction action, the conversation usually starts with The Wandering Earth. But before that series became the face of modern Chinese sci-fi, there was another film that tried and struggled to launch China into big-budget space warfare cinema. That movie is Shanghai Fortress, released in 2019. On paper, it sounds promising. Alien invasion, global military defense, space-based weapons, a major futuristic metropolis under siege. In practice, it became one of the most divisive sci-fi action films China has produced. So today I want to talk about Shanghai Fortress, what it was trying to be, why it failed to, and why it still matters when we're talking about space-only action sci-fi outside the US. Shanghai Fortress is set in a near future where Earth is under attack by an alien force harvesting the planet's energy. Humanity's last line of defense is not spread evenly across the globe. It's concentrated, specifically in Shanghai, which has been turned into a fortified megacity protected by advanced energy shields, aerial defenses, and space-based weapons platforms. The story follows a young soldier assigned to the city's defense alongside a brilliant female military commander, and they prepare for what is framed as a decisive battle for Earth's survival. This is structurally a space war premise. The problem is execution. Here's where Shanghai Fortress sits awkwardly in your space-only action category. There are space elements, orbital weapons, alien spacecraft, references to off-world conflict, and space as the strategic domain that decides the war. But almost all of the action comes back down to Earth. The battles focus on city defense, ground combat, and aerial engagements over Shanghai. Space exists as a backdrop, as infrastructure, rather than a primary battleground. Compared to Yamato, where the ship is the war, The Wandering Earth 2, where orbit is constantly contested, Space Sweepers, where every fight happens in a vacuum, Shanghai Fortress feels constrained. It wants the scale of space war without leaving the city. This is the film's single biggest issue. At its core, Shanghai Fortress is not actually a war movie. It's a romantic melodrama set during an alien invasion. The emotional focus is longing, missed connections, and personal loyalty, rather than sacrifice, strategy, or collective survival. That tonal choice constantly undercuts the stakes. Moments that should feel desperate instead feel sentimental. Militarized decisions are framed emotionally rather than strategically. In contrast, The Wandering Earth 2 treats individual lives as expendable. Yamato treats sacrifice as unavoidable. Shanghai Fortress treats the war as a backdrop for romance, and that disconnect is why many viewers rejected it. The reception was rough. Critics and audiences pointed to weak narrative cohesion, underdeveloped military logic, inconsistent visual effects, and especially tonal confusion. It didn't fail because the idea was bad. It failed because it couldn't decide what kind of movie it was. Romance, disaster sci-fi, military space defense. It tries all three and commits fully to none. As a result, it became a cautionary example within Chinese sci-fi filmmaking. Despite its failure, Shanghai Fortress matters for one reason. It shows a transition point. This film sits between early, uncertain Chinese sci-fi experiments and the full commitment seriousness of The Wandering Earth 2. You can see the lessons being learned. Space war needs clarity of purpose. Spectacle needs ideological coherence. and emotional stakes must serve the premise, not replace it. In that sense, Shanghai Fortress is a stepping stone, not a destination. Shanghai Fortress is not a great space action movie, but it is an important one. It shows what happens when a film reaches for space warfare without committing to its scale, its consequences, or its worldview, and it helps explain why the Chinese sci-fi industry pivoted so hard afterward toward films that treat space conflict with seriousness, clarity, and intent. Most action sci-fi movies use war as their engine, battles, escalation, victory, or defeat. Zhang-Yi, released in 2023, goes in a very different direction. Yes, it's science fiction, yes, it's about warfare, and yes, it's connected to a space-based conflict, but Zhang-Yi isn't really interested in the fight itself, it's interested in what happens after war has already broken the world. So today I want to talk about what Zhang-Yi is actually doing, why it feels quieter than other space action films from South Korea and China, and why it still belongs in the conversation around modern non-US science fiction. Zhang-Yi takes place in a future where Earth has become nearly uninhabitable due to climate collapse. Humanity has split. Some live in space-based shelters and colonies, while a long, drawn-out civil war continues over what's left of the planet. That war's most legendary figure is Zhang-Yi, an elite mercenary commander whose battlefield performance was so exceptional that she became indispensable. Eventually, she's mortally wounded. Instead of letting her die, a corporation preserves her brain data and begins cloning her consciousness into combat androids, hoping to recreate the perfect soldier over and over again. On paper, that sounds like classic action sci-fi. In reality, the film takes a much smaller, more personal angle. This is important to be upfront about. Zhang-Yi has action, but it deliberately limits it. You see combat testing simulations, android duels, and flashes of battlefield memory. But there are no large-scale space battles on screen. The war exists mostly in recordings, in simulations, and in institutional memory. Unlike Space Sweepers, where action is constant, or The Wandering Earth 2, where space combat escalates relentlessly, Zhang-Yi treats fighting as something already absorbed into the system. Combat has been processed, optimized, and industrialized, and that's the point. At its core, Zhang-Yi is not about who wins the war, it's about who owns a person once their mind becomes data. The emotional center of the story isn't the warrior, it's her daughter, now an engineer who works on the cloned combat programs. She's not trying to win the war, she's trying to make sense of her mother's endless replication, the moral cost of perfection, and the idea that sacrifice has become an exportable product. Every time the android version of Zhang-Yi fails a combat test, it resets. Memories wiped, improvements made. What's being optimized is suffering. This is one of the calmest action-adjacent sci-fi films you'll ever watch. No bombastic speeches, no hero moments, no military triumph. The tone is restrained, clinical, and emotionally distant, which makes sense because the film views war as bureaucracy, not chaos. In this world, combat is R&D, soldiers are IP, and death is just a failed iteration. A lot of viewers came into Zhang-Yi expecting a heavy action movie, a war-torn sci-fi epic, or a Korean version of a militarized AI combat. That's not what this film is. Critics generally appreciated the concept, the restraint, and the thematic clarity. Audiences were more split, especially those hoping for sustained action or grand space warfare. This is closer to thoughtful sci-fi drama with action elements than a full action spectacle. Placed alongside your other space action entries, Zhang-Yi becomes war as intellectual property. It's less interested in how battles are fought and more interested in how violence becomes repeatable, sellable, and detached from humanity. That makes it quieter, but also more disturbing. Zhang-Yi isn't a crowd-pleasing space action movie. It's a cool-headed warning about turning soldiers into products, about memory as fuel, and about what happens once war no longer ends. It just iterates.
I'm listening. man and one young woman. No cause for alarm.
No reason to use weapons, sir.
Put your goddamn guns down, Major, on the double.
I repeat, objects are unarmed.
So there's a set of movies, one's Attraction and the other one's Attraction Invasion. We're going to be talking about the sequel, Attraction Invasion. Most space action movies draw a clean line. There's space, there's Earth, and conflict usually stays on one side or the other. Attraction Invasion, released in 2020, does not keep that line clean. This is a film that starts with alien contact, escalates into military confrontation, and then pushes the consequences of space-level power directly into civilian life. It's louder than Jung-E, more kinetic than Shanghai Fortress, and far more interested in escalation than restraint. So today I want to talk about what Attraction Invasion is trying to do, how its space action elements actually function, and why it's one of the most aggressively confrontational non-US sci-fi action films of the last decade. Attraction Invasion picks up after the events of Attraction. I suppose I should have probably watched that first, but I didn't. In the first film, an alien ship crash lands on Earth. Moscow becomes ground zero for first contact. Fear, misunderstanding, and force define the response. The sequel assumes one thing immediately. Contact has already happened, and humanity handled it badly. Now the question isn't, are they friendly? It's what happens after we provoke something more powerful than us. That framing matters because this film is as much about retaliation as it is about invasion. This is where Attraction Invasion fits your space action discussion, and where it becomes tricky. There are alien spacecraft, orbital threats, off-world technology, and the constant implication that Earth is a secondary theater, but very little of the movie takes place in space. Instead, space functions as strategic dominance, looming escalation, and existential pressure. The message is clear: if this war moves fully into space, Earth does not win. That makes the ground-level battles feel tense, because they're framed as preventative desperation, not confident defense. Unlike Space Sweepers, which leans into scrappy momentum, or Yamato, which treats combat as ritualized sacrifice, Attraction Invasion is blunt. The action is loud, chaotic, and aggressive. Alien technology collides directly with police forces, military units, and civilians. Cities aren't symbols here, they're impact zones. The film constantly emphasizes how unprepared Earth is for this level of conflict. Everything feels one step away from annihilation, not because of strategy, but because escalation is spiraling out of control. This is not a hopeful sci-fi film. It's not even particularly curious. The tone is rooted in fear of the unknown, distrust of authority, and panic once power imbalance becomes undeniable. Humans in this movie are reactive, fractured, and often wrong. That's a key difference from The Wandering Earth 2, where coordination is salvation, or Yamato, where discipline defines survival. In Attraction Invasion, humanity's greatest weakness is impulse, and space-level technology punishes impulse immediately. This movie split audiences hard. Some appreciated the scale of destruction, the commitment to escalation, the refusal to soften its premise. Others rejected the heavy-handedness, the aggressive tone, and the near absence of restraint. Critically, the film is often described as visually impressive, emotionally overwhelming, and philosophically blunt. It doesn't ask subtle questions, it asks one harsh one: what if first contact doesn't forgive mistakes? Attraction Invasion becomes space war as judgment, not exploration, not cooperation, not even conquest. Judgment. And that makes it one of the most adversarial non-US sci-fi action films in this lineup of films that we're talking about today. This is not a space-only action movie in the strict sense, but it belongs in this series because the conflict originates beyond Earth. Space power dictates every tactical decision, and escalation towards orbit is the looming threat throughout. Space isn't the setting, it's the leverage, and that still counts. Attraction Invasion is not gentle sci-fi, it's not philosophical, it's not optimistic. It's a film about what happens when humanity meets something stronger and responds badly. The action is loud, the message is harsh, and the consequences are absolute. That makes it uncomfortable and interesting. This movie is crazy. Most action sci-fi movies use spectacle to thrill you. Hardcore Henry tries to do something else. It tries to assault you. Released in 2015 and produced primarily outside the US, Hardcore Henry isn't just an action sci-fi movie, it's a full-length experiment in first-person perspective. No cutaways, no traditional framing, no emotional distance. You don't watch the protagonist fight, you are the protagonist fighting. So today I want to talk about what Hardcore Henry is actually doing, why it's still one of the most extreme action sci-fi films ever made, and why it both succeeds and collapses under its own ambition. The premise is simple on purpose. Henry wakes up in a laboratory. He cannot speak. He barely remembers who he is. Large portions of his body are cybernetic. Before he can process any of that, he's thrown into a violent chase involving mercenaries, enhanced soldiers, telekinetic antagonists, and constant pursuit. The story exists only to justify movement. There is no mystery to solve, no philosophical debate, no slow build. The plot's sole function is to keep you sprinting forward. Hardcore Henry is absolutely science fiction, but only at the level required to enable non-stop combat. You get cybernetic augmentation, neural interfaces, enhanced reflexes, and energy-based abilities. But none of this is explored. Technology isn't questioned. It's not contextualized. It's not moralized. Sci-fi here is fuel, not subject matter. If Jung-E asks who owns a soldier's mind, and Space Sweepers asks who benefits from space labor, Hardcore Henry asks only one thing: how fast can this go? This is where the movie becomes unique. The camera never leaves first person. Every punch, every fall, every reload. Your viewpoint is the weapon and the target at the same time. The action is relentless, creatively staged, and physically exhausting to watch. There are moments of genuine brilliance, choreography that only works because the frame refuses to blink, but there's a cost. Without breath, escalation loses meaning. Without contrast, intensity becomes noise. Eventually, adrenaline stops spiking and starts flattening. Unlike the other films that we've covered, Hardcore Henry has almost no interest in consequence. Deaths are instantaneous, violence is constant, pain is temporary. Even when Henry is injured, the movie treats it as a mechanical delay, not a cost. Hardcore Henry exists in a closed loop. Action doesn't change anything, it just reloads. Reactions to Hardcore Henry were extreme in both directions. Some viewers praised its originality, its physical commitment, and its refusal to compromise. Others experienced motion sickness, fatigue, and emotional disengagement. Critically, the film is often described as technically impressive, conceptually daring, but narratively hollow, and those things can all be true at the same time. Hardcore Henry becomes action as sensation, not story, not ideology, not consequence, just sensation. Even if you don't like Hardcore Henry, it matters because it pushed the genre to a boundary most films won't cross. It asked what happens when immersion replaces framing. What's left when plot becomes momentum? How long can action sustain itself without reflection? Most action sci-fi afterward quietly answered, not this long, and pulled back. Hardcore Henry is not a balanced film. It's not thoughtful, it's not subtle, and it's not patient. But it is fearless. It took action sci-fi and stripped away almost everything except motion. Whether that feels exhilarating or exhausting depends entirely on what you think action is for. If you've ever wondered what happened to classic Japanese giant robot hero movies, Bravestorm might be the closest thing we've gotten to a modern theatrical takusatsu mecha revival, and somehow it flew completely under the radar. Released in 2017, Bravestorm is a fully live-action Japanese mech and superhero film that revives two lesser-known but historically important takusatsu franchises from the early 1970s, Silver Mask and Super Robot Red Baron. Instead of making a simple nostalgia remake, the film takes a much riskier approach. It completely reboots both properties, merges them into a single timeline, and reframes them as a post-apocalyptic science fiction story centered on time travel, extinction, and large-scale mech warfare. Bravestorm was directed, written, and produced by Hawanya Okobi, a filmmaker with deep roots in Japanese special effects cinema. The film runs just over 80 minutes and received a proper theatrical theatrical release in Japan rather than being produced as a television special or direct-to-video project. The distinction matters because Bravestorm aims to look and feel like a real movie. It uses cinema-grade digital effects, staged large-scale city destruction, and presents its giant robots as physical, heavy machines rather than cartoonish set pieces. To understand what Bravestorm is doing, you need some context on what it's rebooting. Silver Mask, which aired in 1971, was one of Japan's early armored live-action heroes. It featured a powerful silver battlesuit and leaned heavily into science fiction, alien conspiracies, and tragic storytelling rather than lighthearted monster of the week plots. Super Robot Red Baron, which followed in 1973, focused on a gigantic piloted humanoid robot. It played like a prototype for later Super Robot anime, but fully realized in live action. Red Baron wasn't just a weapon, it was a heroic guardian figure, and the show became quietly influential on later mecha concepts. Bravestorm doesn't just reference these series, it understands their themes and reconstructs them with a modern sci-fi frame. The film opens in the year 2050, and the story immediately establishes that humanity has already lost. Earth is nearly extinct, the planet has been terraformed by alien invaders known as the Kilgis, and the machine responsible for that extinction is a massive alien robot called Black Baron. The last remaining humans are members of the Kasuga family. With no future left, they develop a desperate plan, travel back in time to prevent the invasion before it begins. Their goal isn't just assassination or sabotage, they tend to steal alien technology, rebuild it with human ingenuity, and create a machine powerful enough to stand against the Black Baron itself. That machine is Red Baron. What makes Bravestorm stand out is that it doesn't rely on a single type of hero. Instead, it uses a dual-scale system that mixes human-level combat with full giant robot warfare. At the human level is Silver Mask, a powered armored suit used for infiltration, alien detection, reconnaissance, and close-quarters fighting. It provides enhanced strength, durability, and mobility, making it effective in urban and underground environments. When the conflict escalates, the film deploys Red Baron, a full-scale piloted humanoid robot constructed using reverse-engineered alien technology. Red Baron exists for one purpose: to confront Black Baron in city-level combat. The story builds tension by moving between these different scales of conflict instead of jumping straight to robot battles. The mech design is easily the standout element of the film. Red Baron is intentionally bulky and armored, with thick limbs and restrained movement. It doesn't leap, flip, or glide. Every step feels heavy, every impact feels costly. The design philosophy prioritizes weight and presence over agility. Black Baron, by contrast, looks more alien and industrial. It feels less like a hero robot and more like a living, terraforming engine, cold, mechanical, and unstoppable. Although most of the effects are digital, the animation emphasizes mass and inertia. Buildings crumble rather than explode cleanly, and the robots move like machines that actually weigh thousands of tons. For a mid-budget production, the mech visuals hold up far better than expected. Tonally, Bravestorm is not comedic takusatsu. The film takes itself seriously, sometimes to a fault. It presents a bleak future, deals with the burden of destiny, and frames heroism as obligation rather than glory. Characters struggle with inevitability and moral responsibility rather than cracking jokes. That seriousness does expose some limitations. Dialogue can feel stiff, and the short runtime leaves little room for deep character development. But the sincerity of the presentation carries the film further than its budget suggests. The central characters reinforce that grounded tone. Silver Mask is portrayed as a soldier-like figure burdened by knowledge of the future. Red Baron's pilot, Ken Coronia, is especially notable. He isn't a trained military operator or idealistic hero. He's a boxer pulled into a world-end conflict he doesn't want. That reluctance helps keep Red Baron from being a simple power fantasy. The film's music was composed by Mike Verta, an internationally active composer who has previously collaborated with Akobe. The score focuses on industrial tension and slow, restraint heroic themes rather than bombastic spectacle. It supports the idea that this is a war being fought out of desperation, not triumph. Critically, Bravestorm received mixed negative reviews. It was frequently criticized for its limited budget, short runtime, and sparse character work. Many reviewers judged it against larger, more expensive sci-fi films and found it lacking. Among takosutatsu and mecha fans, however, the reception has been far warmer. The film is often praised for respecting its source material, treating giant robots seriously, and attempting something ambitious rather than playing things safe. Over time, Bravestorm has settled into cult favorite status. What makes Bravestorm important isn't that it's flawless. It absolutely isn't. What makes it important is what it proves. It proves that live-action mecha films don't have to be enormous American blockbusters to exist. It proves that traditional takosutatsu concepts can still work when updated thoughtfully, and it proves that giant robots can still feel cinematic when they're treated as machines instead of superpowers. We don't get many films like Bravestorm anymore, and honestly, we probably should.
The other worlds are not as nice as I am. They hate your kind. Won't be easy to get away from them.
If Iron Sky was a cult sci-fi curiosity, then Iron Sky: The Coming Race is what happens when a sequel stops pretending to be reasonable and fully embraces chaos. Released in 2019, The Coming Race is a Finnish-German science fiction action film directed by Timo Verensola, something like that. It is the sequel to the 2012 cult film Iron Sky, which famously imagined Nazis fleeing to the dark side of the moon after World War II. This follow-up does not attempt to tone things down. Instead, it cranks everything up. Bigger ideas, stranger concepts, louder satire, and noticeably heavier emphasis on pulp sci-fi imagery, including powered armor, flight suits, and mecha-adjacent technologies. Unlike the first film, which stayed largely focused on space satire and political allegory, The Coming Race dramatically expands the scope of its universe. It leans hard into conspiracy theory aesthetics, retrofuturism, and the kind of science fiction ideas that feel pulled directly from the mid-20th century pulp magazines. The result is a film that is less restrained, less subtle, and far more interested in spectacle than plausibility. The story takes place several years after the events of Iron Sky. Earth is no longer a functioning world. Nuclear war has left the surface largely uninhabitable, and remaining remnants of humanity are living either on the moon or in orbital habitats. When those last safe locations are threatened, a desperate expedition is launched to find humanity's original homeland, a mythical refuge said to lie deep beneath the Earth's surface. That destination is the Hollow Earth. The Hollow Earth in The Coming Race is not subtle. It is filled with an advanced reptilian civilization, vast underground technological structures, familiar historical figures preserved in bizarre forms, and numerous nods to fringe theories, including Atlantis, ancient astronauts, and hidden human origins. At the center of it all is the Vril, a reptilian species inspired by 19th century pseudoscience and occult conspiracy lore. This is where the film's tone decisively shifts from satire into full science fiction absurdism. Mechanically and aesthetically, The Coming Race leans heavily into retro-industrial technology. Instead of sleek future designs, the machines resemble diesel-punk machinery, heavy aviation equipment, industrial exoskeletons, and clunky-powered flight suits. While the film doesn't feature traditional giant robots, it absolutely occupies the mech-adjacent space. Characters frequently use powered combat gear, mechanized armor, and weaponized exoframes that enhance strength, endurance, and mobility. These designs sit somewhere between powered armor, aviation rigs, and proto-mech suits. The technology feels intentionally impractical. Everything is oversized, noisy, and visibly mechanical. Pistons move, plates lock into place, jets roar instead of glide. This is not high-tech minimalism. It's exaggerated industrial power taken to a satirical extreme. Even when the film uses CGI, it emphasizes weight and over-engineering rather than elegance. Tonally, The Coming Race is very different from Bravestorm. This film is unapologetically satirical. It mocks political extremism, nationalism, corporate greed, climate denial, and humanity's tendency to repeat self-destructive behaviors. The dialogue is deliberately broad, and many characters exist as exaggerated archetypes rather than fully grounded individuals. This is intentional. The film wants to feel like a pulp comic brought to life. That said, the satire isn't always consistent. At times, the film leans more towards self-parody than commentary. There are moments that feel chaotic, overstuffed, or tonally scattered. Some viewers view this as freedom, others see it as a lack of focus. But regardless of where you land, The Coming Race is never boring. The cast includes returning characters from Iron Sky along with new additions representing different remnants of humanity's factions. Performance styles vary wildly. Some actors play it straight, others go full camp, which contributes to the film's uneven but distinctive tone. It feels less like a traditional ensemble film and more like a moving parody of mid-century sci-fi serials. From a production standpoint, The Coming Race is notable for how it was made. Like its predecessor, it relied heavily on crowdfunding, international collaboration, and fan involvement. This unconventional production model influenced both the film's ambition and its limitations. The budget is clearly stretched, but also used creatively. The filmmakers prioritize imaginative concepts over polish. Critically, Iron Sky, The Coming Race received mixed reactions. Some reviewers criticized it for being unfocused, tonally inconsistent, and overly crammed with ideas. Others embraced it as a rare example of a film that commits completely to being strange, messy, and unapologetically pulpy. Among science fiction cult audiences, it has developed a reputation as a love it or hate it experience. What makes The Coming Race interesting is a mecha-focused discussion isn't traditional robot combat, it's its relationship to mechanized power. The film treats technology as a blunt extension of ideology and ego. Powered armor doesn't make characters heroic. Flight suits don't solve humanity's problems. Every machine is bigger, louder, and more destructive, and still fails to save anyone from themselves. That thematic through-line is what connects The Coming Race to the broader mecha tradition. Like many classic mecha stories, it asks whether increased mechanical power actually brings progress or simply accelerates collapse. It just happens to ask that question while riding dinosaurs and fighting reptilian elites underground. Iron Sky, The Coming Race is not a clean sci-fi film. It is loud, messy, strange, and deeply unsure. But it is also one of the rare modern films willing to embrace truly wild science fiction concepts without sanding off their edges. And in a genre increasingly dominated by safe narratives, that alone makes it worth talking about. As I was working through these films, I kept coming back to that initial Yamato rewatch. Not because everything I've talked about looks or feels the same, most of it doesn't, but because they share the same underlying impulse. The desire to use science fiction action to say something about scale, pressure, and consequence. Whether it's a desperate warship crossing space, a giant robot defending a city, or humanity literally digging into the earth for answers, these stories all treat action as more than background noise. Movement matters, impact matters, failure matters. And that's something international science fiction, especially outside Hollywood's formula, still seems willing to explore. None of these films are perfect. Some are limited by budget, some are messy, some are strange experiments that don't fully come together, but they're trying things, visually, thematically, structurally, that you don't often see in mainstream sci-fi action anymore. Rewatching Space Battleship Yamato didn't just remind me why I love science fiction, it reminded me why I love science fiction action. I love a great space battle, when it's used to express desperation, resolve, and the weight of survival, instead of just spectacle for its own sake. And once you start looking beyond the obvious places, you realize there's a lot more of that spirit still out there. You just have to be willing to go searching for it. And we'll keep searching for new films to explore for the next video. Until then, please like, please subscribe, please share, and please have a good day, and I will catch you later.